Late one evening, as the golden sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the rolling fields, old Farmer Henry stood by his fence, watching his horse, Dusty. The animal had been with him for over 2 decades, through storms, droughts, and endless summers. But now Dusty was frail, his ribs showing, his legs trembling under his own weight. Henry sighed. He had no choice. Feeding Dusty had become impossible, and the vet had warned that the horse was in pain. The butcher in the nearby town had offered a small sum for the horse. It was painful, but Henry convinced himself it was the right thing to do. The next morning, he led Dusty to the market, his heart heavy with guilt. Dusty walked slowly, his hooves dragging on the dusty road. Every step felt like betrayal. Henry couldn't bring himself to look the horse in the eye. As they reached the marketplace, Henry handed the rope to the butcher, avoiding any last glance. The butcher, a burly man with strong hands, nodded and led Dusty away. Henry turned quickly, heading home, trying to shake off the sorrow that weighed him down. But something strange happened. Just as the butcher reached the entrance of his shop, Dusty reared up, something he hadn't done in years. The old horse neighed loudly, yanking the rope from the butcher's hands and galloping down the street. People gasped. A horse that had seemed too weak to even walk properly was now charging forward with a speed that defied logic. Dusty ran, his hooves thundering against the cobblestone streets. The butcher shouted, chasing after him, but the horse moved like a ghost, slipping through alleys, dodging carts and startled pedestrians. Dusty wasn't just running. He had a destination. The townsfolk watched in awe as the horse took the road back towards the farm. The butcher, breathless and sweating, gave up the chase. Someone ran to tell Henry. Back at the farm, Henry was sitting on his porch, lost in thought. When he heard the commotion, he looked up to see Dusty galloping towards him. His heart skipped a beat. The horse stopped right in front of him, his body heaving, nostrils flaring. Henry stared at him, stunned. How had Dusty managed to do this? The horse that had seemed too weak to take a few steps had run miles back home. Something inside Henry broke. He knelt beside Dusty, running a trembling hand through the horse's mane. Tears welled up in his eyes. He had spent years with this creature, working the land, sharing quiet moments. And yet, when Dusty needed him the most, he had given up on him. But Dusty had refused to be given up on. Henry made a decision. The next morning, he sent a farmhand to the market with a small sack of coins. The butcher's payment returned. Dusty would stay. The old horse had chosen where he wanted to be, and Henry would make sure he had the peaceful days he deserved. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened. Dusty, once frail and weak, started gaining strength. Henry, fueled by a new sense of purpose, fed him the best grains, let him rest in the warm sun, and groomed his coat every evening. Slowly, the horse that had once been a shadow of himself began to shine again. Neighbors whispered about the miracle. How had an old, dying horse suddenly regained life? Some said it was a sign of fate. Others believed Dusty had been given a second chance because of his will to live. But Henry knew the truth. It wasn't just Dusty who had found new strength. It was him too. The bond between them deepened. Every morning, Dusty stood by the fence, waiting for Henry, and together they would walk the fields. The farmer no longer saw the horse as weak or useless. He saw a friend who had fought for their home. Years passed, and Dusty lived far longer than anyone expected. He never pulled another plow, never carried another load, but his presence alone changed everything on the farm. Henry, once a man hardened by life, softened. He spoke to Dusty like an old companion, telling him about his worries, his dreams, the weather, and the stories of the past. Then, one morning, as the sun rose over the farm, Dusty lay down under the old oak tree and closed his eyes. This time, he didn't get up. But there was no pain in his departure, only peace. Henry sat beside him for hours, running his fingers through Dusty's mane one last time. There were no tears, no regrets, only gratitude. The story of Dusty spread far beyond the town. He wasn't just a horse. He was a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the unspoken bonds that connect souls. Henry knew one thing for sure. Dusty had never been weak. And perhaps, in the end, Dusty had saved him, too. Henry sat under the oak tree long after the morning had faded into afternoon. The gentle rustling of leaves above him whispered memories of the past. Long days in the field, dusty, steady hooves pressing into the earth, the rhythmic creak of the wooden plow, the quiet companionship of a soul who had never spoken a word yet had said everything. The farm had never felt so silent. That night, Henry didn't go inside. He stayed near Dusty, watching the stars blink into existence. He thought about all the times he had nearly given up on Dusty, on himself, on life itself. But Dusty had never let him. That horse had defied expectations, defied weakness, defied death itself once. And now, he had left on his own terms, in his own home, beneath the tree where they had spent so many quiet afternoons together. In the morning, Henry knew what he had to do. With his old, calloused hands, he dug a resting place beneath the oak tree, right where Dusty had chosen to lay down for the last time. Every scoop of earth was a labor of love, an act of respect for the friend who had given him so much. It took hours, and when he finally finished, he carefully placed Dusty into the earth, covering him with the soil that had once been tilled under his hooves. When the last handful of dirt was placed, Henry stood back and looked at the spot. It wasn't enough. Dusty had been more than just a horse. He had been family. He needed something more than an unmarked grave. So Henry set to work. For the next several days, he poured all his time into building something he had never built before. Wooden marker. He carved every letter with care. Dusty. A friend, a fighter, a legend. It was simple, but it was right. But something strange started happening after that. The farm, which had felt tired and lifeless just months ago, seemed to come alive again. The crops grew taller, greener. The fruit trees bore more than they ever had before. Even the animals seemed different, stronger, healthier. Henry, too, felt a change. He woke up earlier, worked harder, felt lighter. The weight he had carried for years, the loneliness, the regrets, the exhaustion, was slowly lifting. And every evening, he would sit under Dusty's tree, speaking aloud as if the horse were still there, listening. Word spread through town about what had happened. People came for miles around to see the tree where the old horse had made his final stand, where the man who had nearly lost everything found a new reason to keep going. Some came to pay respects, others just to hear the story firsthand. And then, one autumn morning, something truly incredible happened. A young boy from the village arrived at Henry's farm, holding the reins of a horse. But not just any horse. A young, wild stallion, black as the night sky, its eyes sharp, its spirit untamed. The boy, no more than 15, stood nervously before Henry. "Mr. Henry," he said, shifting on his feet. "This horse, he don't listen to nobody. Won't pull a cart, won't take a saddle, won't even let folks near him. My pa says he's no good, says we should sell him off." But the boy glanced at the tree, at the wooden marker that bore Dusty's name. "I heard about Dusty, and I thought maybe, if anyone could teach this one how to be strong, it'd be you." Henry looked at the horse, and for the first time in years, something stirred deep inside him, something he hadn't felt since the day Dusty ran home. He stepped forward, meeting the wild stallion's gaze. The animal snorted, pawing at the dirt, its muscles tense. But Henry didn't flinch. He reached out a weathered hand, slow and steady. The stallion didn't move. It didn't bolt, didn't rear. Instead, it stood there, watching him with something almost like understanding. Henry smiled. Maybe, just maybe, Dusty had sent him a new friend. Henry let his hand hover, just inches from the stallion's muzzle. The young horse's nostrils flared as he sniffed the air, his dark eyes filled with a mix of defiance and curiosity. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, the stallion took a step closer, his breath warm against Henry's fingertips. The boy holding the reins gasped. "That's the first time he's let someone touch him," he whispered. Henry's fingers brushed the stallion's coat, sleek, strong, and untamed. A familiar warmth spread through his chest. It had been years since he'd worked with a young horse, but something told him this one had come for a reason. "What's his name?" Henry asked, not taking his eyes off the animal. The boy hesitated. "Ain't got one. Nobody kept him long enough to give him one." Henry thought for a moment. Then, looking into the stallion's defiant gaze, he said, "Storm." The name felt right. The horse was wild, unpredictable, like the summer storms that rolled over the farm, bringing destruction and renewal all at once. The boy smiled. "Storm. I like that." Henry nodded. "He'll stay here." The boy's eyes widened. "You mean you'll take him?" Henry gave a slow nod. "I reckon I will." The boy grinned, handed over the reins, and took off running back to town. Henry turned back to Storm, still holding the leather strap loosely in his hand. The horse pulled back slightly, testing him. Henry didn't resist. He simply stood firm, patient, watching. Storm's ears flicked, his muscles tense. But Henry had seen this before. Young horses didn't trust easily. They had to be shown, not told. That night, Henry didn't force Storm into the barn. Instead, he let the stallion roam the fenced pasture near Dusty's tree. He sat on the porch, watching as Storm paced, occasionally stopping to glance at the old oak, where Dusty had once stood. Henry could almost hear Dusty's steady breathing, feel the warmth of his presence. "Don't worry," Henry murmured into the night air. "I ain't making the same mistake twice." Days passed, then weeks. At first, Storm avoided Henry, keeping his distance. But Henry didn't chase. He didn't force. He just showed up, morning and night, bringing food, standing nearby, letting Storm get used to him. Little by little, Storm began to change. One morning, as Henry poured fresh water into the trough, he felt a nudge against his back. He turned slowly. Storm stood there, staring at him, waiting. Henry grinned. "Took you long enough." From that moment on, the real training began. Storm was fast, powerful, but headstrong. He fought against the bridle, resisted the saddle, bucked whenever Henry tried to guide him. But Henry didn't break his spirit. He didn't try to force obedience. Instead, he worked with Storm's instincts, his fire, his strength. Every evening, Henry spoke to Storm the same way he had spoken to Dusty. "You're not meant to be tamed," he'd say, running a brush through the stallion's dark coat. "You're meant to be understood." By the end of the first month, Storm no longer ran when Henry approached. By the second, he allowed Henry to ride him, just a few slow steps at first, then a trot, then a gallop. The wind howled as they raced across the fields, and for the first time in years, Henry felt young again. But it wasn't just Henry who noticed. People from the town started visiting, curious about the horse that no one else could handle. They watched in awe as Henry rode Storm bareback. No saddle, no reins, just trust. Whispers spread through the town. That horse was born to run. No one else could tame him. He's got Dusty's soul, I swear it. Henry never paid attention to the talk. He didn't need to. He knew the truth. Storm wasn't a replacement for Dusty. He wasn't here to fill a void. He was here to remind Henry of something he had almost forgotten. That life doesn't end when something is lost. It changes. It moves forward. Months turned to years. Storm grew stronger, faster, wiser. Henry, too, changed. His steps became lighter, his heart fuller. He no longer woke up feeling the weight of loss. Instead, he woke up with purpose. And then, one fateful day, something happened that tested everything. A fire. It started in the hills beyond the farm, a spark in the dry summer grass. By the time Henry saw the smoke rising, the flames were already licking at the edges of his land. The wind carried embers through the fields, setting the crops ablaze. Henry ran to the barn, untying the livestock, shouting for them to flee. The sky turned orange, the heat unbearable. He coughed, stumbling as he tried to guide the animals away. But then he heard it, an ear-splitting scream. Storm. Henry spun around. The stallion was still in the pasture, trapped as flames closed in on all sides. The smoke thickened, and for the first time, Henry saw fear in the horse's eyes. Without thinking, Henry ran back, ignoring the shouts of neighbors who had come to help. He reached the gate and threw it open. "Storm," he yelled. "Come on, boy." But the stallion didn't move. He was panicked, rearing up, eyes wild. Henry didn't hesitate. He ran straight into the pasture. The heat was overwhelming, but he didn't care. He grabbed Storm's bridle, tugging hard. "I know you're scared," he whispered, "but you gotta trust me." Storm's breathing was ragged. his muscles trembling. Henry met his gaze, steady and unwavering. Then, just as the flames crept closer, Storm moved. With a powerful kick of his hooves, he turned and bolted. Henry barely had time to grab hold of his mane before the stallion leapt over the fence, carrying them both to safety. The fire raged through the fields, but the farm itself was saved. The barn, the house, even Dusty's tree, all untouched. When the flames finally died down, and the town came to help rebuild, Henry stood beside Storm, running a hand down his powerful neck. The horse had saved him, just as Dusty had, all those years ago. And Henry knew, without a doubt, that he had been right about one thing. Some bonds can never be broken. Not by time, not by distance, not even by death. Because sometimes, the ones we lose never really leave us. And sometimes, they send us exactly who we need. The months after the fire changed everything. Henry's farm, once a quiet place of solitude, became the talk of the town. People marveled at how the old man and his wild stallion had survived the blaze, how Storm had leaped over the fence like a creature out of legend. Strangers came by just to catch a glimpse of the magnificent horse, his dark coat gleaming under the sun, his presence commanding. Henry, though never one for attention, welcomed them with quiet pride. He knew Storm wasn't just an ordinary horse. He was something more, something rare. The town's whispers grew louder. That horse was meant for greatness. He's got the heart of a warrior. That old farmer and his horse, they're a legend now. But Henry didn't let the words distract him. He had work to do. The fire had taken a good portion of his fields, and rebuilding would take time. Storm, always by his side, had become more than just a horse. He was his partner, his shadow, his reason to keep moving forward. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, a stranger arrived at Henry's farm. He was tall, dressed in a fine coat, his boots polished, his eyes sharp with purpose. He introduced himself as William Carson, a horse breeder from the city. "I've heard stories about your stallion," he said, leaning against the fence as he watched Storm graze. "A horse like that belongs in the big leagues. Racing, competition, he could be famous." Henry shook his head. "He's not for sale." Carson chuckled. "Everything has a price, old man. I'll pay whatever you want." But Henry didn't waver. Some things aren't about money. Carson's smile tightened. He pulled a check from his coat, the numbers written in bold, tempting ink. "Think about it," he said, leaving the check on the fence post before walking away. Henry didn't need to. That night, he burned the check in the fireplace, watching the flames consume it, just as the fire had once tried to consume his farm. But Carson wasn't the only one who wanted Storm. Over the next few weeks, others came, wealthy men, breeders, racers, each offering more than the last. They saw Storm's power, his spirit, his untapped potential. They saw a champion. Henry saw something else. He saw a friend. And friends weren't for sale. But the more he refused, the more persistent they became. Some tried persuasion. Others tried manipulation. Then, one night, someone tried something worse. Henry woke to the sound of hooves pounding against the earth, a sharp, frantic cry cutting through the darkness. He bolted from his bed, grabbing his lantern and shotgun, his heart pounding. The pasture was empty. The fence was broken. Storm was gone. Henry ran faster than he had in years, his boots kicking up dirt as he followed the trail of broken branches and disturbed grass. The night was thick with silence, save for the distant sound of horses moving fast. He reached the edge of town just in time to see a wagon disappearing down the road, Storm tied to the back, fighting against the ropes. Henry didn't think. He acted. He jumped onto the nearest horse, an old mare tied outside the general store, and kicked hard, urging her into a gallop. The chase was on. The thieves had a head start, but Henry knew the land. He took a shortcut through the fields, cutting them off at the old bridge. When they saw him waiting, shotgun in hand, they hesitated. Henry leveled the barrel. "Let him go," he said, his voice calm, steady. The leader of the group, a man with a scar across his cheek, sneered. "You're too old to stop us." Henry didn't blink. "Try me." For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a curse, the man cut Storm loose. The stallion reared up, kicking wildly. then bolted toward Henry. The thieves turned and fled, their wagon disappearing into the night. Storm trembled as Henry approached, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with fear. Henry placed a hand on his neck, whispering softly, "It's all right, boy. You're safe now." Storm pressed his head against Henry's chest, his muscles relaxing. Together, they walked home, the stars above them bright and endless. Word of the attempted theft spread quickly. The town was outraged. The sheriff promised to find the men responsible, but Henry knew better. Storm was too valuable, too rare. As long as he stayed, someone would always try to take him. And so, Henry made a decision, one that broke his heart but felt right. The next morning, he saddled Storm and rode into the hills, following the old trails that Dusty had once known so well. They rode for hours, past the burned fields, past the familiar landmarks of his farm, higher and higher until they reached the wide, open plains beyond the valley. There in the distance stood a herd of wild horses, their manes flowing like rivers of silk. Storm lifted his head, his ears twitching. Henry dismounted, removing the bridle, the saddle, everything that bound Storm to him. "Go," he said, stepping back. Storm hesitated. His dark eyes met Henry's, questioning. Henry smiled, though his chest ached. "You were never meant to be caged." For a long moment, Storm stood still. Then, with a final glance, he turned and ran. The wind caught his mane, his hooves thundered against the earth, and within moments, he was one with the wild. Henry watched until he could no longer see him, until the dust settled and silence returned. He stood there for a long time alone. And yet, he didn't feel alone, because some bonds can never be broken. Not by time, not by distance, not even by letting go.